Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of Home Education Matters, and today I'm joined by Cheryl Moy from Educational Freedom, which is a really popular and very large website which helps home educators to answer a lot of the questions that we might have, and basically provides a pretty similar service to the podcast. Actually, it just puts a lot of information out there, and it also allows a really nice back and forth between home educators that may have questions. So I'm really excited to have Cheryl on the podcast today. And she's very well known in the home education circles, so it's always very lovely to have famous home educators on the podcast. And today we're going to be talking about how to prepare a report for the local authority. And you'll notice I'm using the word prepare and not write, because I learned early on in doing this podcast that you don't have to write a report. You can perform it as some sort of interpretive dance to the local authority if you so wished. But most people don't. Most people do write a report. And I wanted to bring Cheryl on today because there are increasing numbers of people who are offering help to home educators to write reports, and it's quite often a paid service. And while some people may find that they want to get that support from somebody else or get someone else to help them write the report, there really is no need to do that. It's a fairly simple process, and it's all about knowing what to put in and what not to put in. And so Cheryl and I are very keen to empower all home educators to feel that they can write the report themselves without having to employ anybody else. And sometimes these people who offered to write the reports aren't even home educators, which just blows my mind, actually. And so Cheryl is here to talk us through how to write a report for the local authority. So first of all, Cheryl, we have a little tradition in our podcast, which is that my very first question, as always, goes something like this. Hi, Cheryl. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Do tell us a little something about you and your home education journey.
Hi. Okay, so thank you for having me. Wow, a little. It's a big, long story, so let's make it short. A long time ago, children were 7, 5 and 1. 7-year-old was bullied by the headmistress when they were 5 and 6. I thought I had no other option but to find another school. Found another school, had a great time for a little bit. Things went downhill because he would not conform to their rules. He wouldn't stand still in queues, those kind of things. Undiagnosed at the time, I knew there was something different with him. One day, bumped into a lady out with school-age children, and I said, "No school today." I'm sure you've all heard those kind of questions. And gone, no, we home educate. And I did you do what now? What's home education? And 3 days later, I deregistered my children. There was no information out there at all, really. I had to rely on what the local authority told me, and I live in one that has always been horrific. I was doorstepped. I was threatened with the police. I was told it was illegal. I had social services called on me, all sorts. And I ended up in a home ed group where people were supporting each other. I quickly became one of the people providing that support, and a few years later created Educational Freedom. And my kids are now 23 and doing a physics degree. He's also diagnosed autistic. 21, a fully qualified mechanic with a little baby. I'm a grandma. And a 17-year-old who works in a nursery and wants to become a Senko. And despite my children aging out, I am still day in, day out, providing support to home educators for free.
You and me both.
It wouldn't be inclusive if there was a charge. And that was our ethos from day one. Educational Freedom was never going to charge home educators. It just felt wrong. So yeah, albeit if anybody wants to donate, because obviously websites have running costs, then feel free.
Yeah, and that's actually exactly how I run the podcast. It's obviously completely free, but recently I started the Buy Me a Coffee scheme.
Yes, we added that too.
Yeah, and it's quite fun, and it's basically really just keeps me in hot drinks while I'm doing the podcast because I'm a big fan of hot drinks when I'm doing the podcast. But also, obviously, the podcast has running costs. I mean, we have to host it on Podbean, and then it sends Podbean is the hosting thing, and it sends it out to Spotify and Apple and all these things. And I did buy myself a microphone and those kind of things. So it is. I think you're right about it's so important that things are free. But I think also, just from a business perspective, it's nice to have the option so that if people like what you're doing, they can say, you know what, this is really cool and let me buy you a coffee or let me subscribe or whatever it is. And I think that is nice to have that option. And I know in the home ed world, there's often a weird, real resistance to any kind of money transaction, even if it's very voluntary and a very voluntary contribution. And personally, as a business person who, if I literally didn't earn any money as a business person, I would not be able to home educate. And many of us are in that situation. I see nothing wrong with making some money as long as it's optional, as long as there are people who, if they don't have the money, they can still listen or interact on the website for free. But if they do have some money and they like what you're doing, then they can pay. And I think that just makes perfect business sense. However, I am drifting off topic. So let's talk about writing reports. So let me just get some nuts and bolts out of the way. So I feel like I'm fairly confident on this, she says, about to make some sort of terrible glaring error. Okay, so the LA can ask for one report a year. Nope. Oh, you see, I've already made a mistake. Oh, dear.
The first hurdle.
Oh, my word. Oh, you wouldn't believe I know about this stuff, would you? That's embarrassing. Okay, Cheryl.
Yeah, that is the one thing people believe. So the local authority has no legal, and this is where my terminology is sometimes wrong. They've got no legal right to demand anything, ever, or make annual enquiries. The guidance suggests, and the guidance is not statutory, so it's not enforceable, but it suggests they make on at least annual basis enquiries. So their duty is to identify children missing education, not to assess home education. But to identify them, they make inquiries to check home education's okay. It's a bit complicated. So they can make informal inquiries. How you respond is up to you. Educational freedom's suggestion in the vast majority of local authorities is to provide written information in the guise of a report.
Once a year.
Some local authorities don't ask once a year, so never offer a report. If they've not asked, don't offer. Some will try saying that they want information more often. It's really down to why they're asking. If they've had concerns before, or if a massive milestone or a change in family circumstances, they could ask again. So there is no standard once a year provide information. It really is down to that family's situation and what the local authority already know about the children. If you've already established a suitable home education and the local authority have gone, yeah, great, see you later, they shouldn't then be asking again in a year for you to repeat yourself and provide info. They could, at a push, check in and ask for a brief update, but there is no need to go down the route of an annual report. Report is a terrible word and it's our own fault for using it, but we couldn't find a better word. But in subsequent years, it's an update rather than a report. Sorry.
Okay, so
it's complicated.
Yeah, that's for sure. So there is no requirement to provide any kind of feedback or information to the local authority. However, there's that kind of woolly area where they sort of saying it should happen and it's advised that it happens and all of that, where local authorities can step into that kind of grey area and say, okay, this is what we want this from you. Now, I'm guessing that along with most other sort of experienced home educators, your advice is not to ignore the local authority, but Okay, so always kind of respond to what the local authority wants. So let's work on the assumption that your local authority basically wants you to give them some sort of feedback of what you're doing every year-ish. So let's work on, we're going to call it a report just because, like you say, that's what everyone calls it, but I appreciate that it's a bad word. So let's call it that for now. But anyone who's listening, I want you to kind of bear in mind that this isn't a report. This is feedback and information that you're voluntarily providing. So what should be in the report and what shouldn't be in the report?
Okay, so most things home educators write in their reports shouldn't be included. And the things that should be often aren't. So a local authority might send you a form or a list. Ignore what the local authority are asking. They ask quite often in school-like terminology. They want timetables. What they really mean is they want to know that the education is full-time and how it's full-time. So what we suggest is you start with your philosophy, your reasoning, why you think home education works for your child, what your beliefs are with it. Oh, and a report in general, 1 to 2 pages. That's all you need if it's informal inquiries. If you've been served a formal notice to satisfy, yes, we go down the more detailed route. But in informal inquiries, your philosophy, a couple of lines. The style you follow could be sort of 2 or 3 lines. That just gives the local authority a little bit of insight into how you educate. It then follows through into how it's full-time. Whether you follow a structure, whether you're more child-led, whether you do term times, weekends, it all just gives the bigger picture. Then you talk about what your child's been learning and how they've been learning it and the resources used. It needs only be half a page to a full page of information. It really does only need to be brief. If you use workbooks, websites, you could include those and then the topics that have been learned within those. If you don't do a formal kind of learning, you'd include some examples of how they've done numeracy and literacy in their play or their outings or whatever. You would need to mention how you meet any special needs, how that affects the home education. If your child is physically disabled and it doesn't affect the education, then you don't need to talk about it. But if they can't use their hands very well and it affects their writing, then you would mention it. Or if they're autistic and they're learning at a different level, for example, than their peers, you would talk about that. You'd include informal learning, documentaries, games, and then you would need to include how you know the education is suitable to your child's age, ability, aptitude, and SEN. So again, if your child's learning at a different age level to their peers, you'd explain why. This could be because they left school learning at a lower level or with content that they'd not grasped, so you're relearning it. Those kind of explanations. Then you would cover what progress has been made in the last year, any social and sport activities, and then you'd need to include any resources either as a separate list or included in the main body. That sounds like a lot, but it really can be condensed into 1 to 2 pages. And the report writing guide, provision and resource report writing guide on educational freedom, has a joke version of a template report right at the back of Lorelei at Clown School. So it just shows you how much information you can cram into a short space without waffling like I do.
Okay, no, that's very helpful waffling. So,
because I'm ADHD, I do waffle. And my natural instinct in the early days was to give loads and loads of information, and it wasn't necessary. So I think having this concise support, the guide, helps rein in that waffling that can then be used against you.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think this, we'll get to that when we talk about what not to put in, but I think it is important that you're slightly constrained in what you put into your report, right? So I've got two questions. My first question is there a reason why it's a written report? I mean, could it be a phone call or a Zoom call, or do you tend to recommend written reports so that you've got the evidence there?
Written so that you've got the evidence. Years and years ago, when we were supporting home educators, before the guidance changed in 2019, you didn't have to give anything at all. So when that changed in 2019, that could be used against you if you didn't provide information. People were having phone calls and or visits, and if the EHE person says, "Do you have a timetable?" and you in person say no or yes, it's this, and you give that information, they can then use that against you. Whereas if they ask it in writing, you can avoid answering that by giving information about how the education's full time. In person or on the phone, they say, "Do you have a timetable?" and you say no, or "You're not entitled to that information." That's a negative thing that they're then writing down and using against you. They can say things like, "Well, that's no good, you need to be doing this," but there's no evidence they've said that. I remember one case quite a few years ago. The EHE did 3 visits in a month, and every time she came back, she gave different advice. The first time was, "Those workbooks are no good, you need to use CGP." She came back a week later and said, "Why have you bought CGP books? They're no good." And then on the third visit, she came with an SAO in hand, having not followed procedure. So we won that, we got that sorted.
I think when it's not written, if it's a phone call or a visit, you're on your own having to reply or respond on the hoof. Whereas if it's written, you're able to come into the groups and go on to Educational Freedom and ask the questions and just kind of get all your ducks in a row as you're writing it, rather than having that pressure of somebody being there asking a question and you thinking, I don't know how I should respond to this. So Okay, my second question then is, I was always led to believe, as an ex-teacher, which was a long time ago, and I only lasted a year, so I don't claim to be any kind of great shakes in that department. But I know that when it comes to Ofsted, and when it comes to anything like that, it was all about showing progress. It was all about sort of saying, my child has gone from X and now they're able to do Y. My child was here and now they're here. Is that the same thing when it comes to reports?
Yeah, progress is a really important part of providing the information. It shows that home ed is working. But if your child, let's say they do formal learning, if from this time last year they've only worked through half of that year's national curriculum, workbooks follow the NC. It just happens like that. But if they've only worked through half of that, your report would give you a chance to explain why that they're now half a year behind. We all know there's no such thing as behind with home ed, but that's how the LA would see it. So talk about the progress, what they could do or couldn't do and now can, or how much they've worked through. It shows that home ed is working, and that gives the local authority less chance of finding fault. It's a little bit more difficult when you don't follow any formal kind of learning, but we do give some examples in the report guide on how to explain that.
What is it like, just sort of quickly, how would you approach that if you're, say, unschooling?
So I would use real life examples maybe. So this time last year, they needed full supervision when baking a cake. Parent would have to weigh out the ingredients and supervise with the use of the oven. This year, in the last year, they've learned to do this fully independently. They're safe now with the oven. They're able to weigh out the ingredients. You'd use real life examples. And I know it's not ideal, but if you looked at, especially in literacy and numeracy, if you looked at the contents of a workbook, you don't have to buy them, you can look online. It tells you what the kids would be learning. They're having to read the full national curriculum. You'll be surprised how much a child naturally learns that is on the curriculum anyway, that is peer equivalent learning. Kids want to halve things, and they might not want to do algebraic equations. That's not an easy day-to-day activity to bring in, but the basics are.
Absolutely. I mean, whenever we were doing fractions or any of that kind of maths, ratios and things, we always took, it was always pizza and cake, basically.
Yeah.
Anything you could cut up that was a circle, even things like radius and diameter. I mean, pretty much if it didn't involve pizza and cake, we weren't doing it. So,
Lego was a popular one in this house. Pizza was as well, but
Lego is much healthier than pizza, that's for sure. So it sounds like the things you're looking to put in are to explain how your child, based on their age, their ability, their aptitude, and any additional needs that they may have, what they've been learning briefly over the last year or however long since your last report, and any kind of progress that they've made, and using real life examples as well as academic examples if you have them, if you're structured.
Yep, absolutely. And that's why at the beginning you would describe your style so that the local authority knows your approach. They won't, if you're full unschooly, they wouldn't expect to see formal examples, unless of course that's the route your kids have chosen through unschooling.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really good advice. So you put your style in at the start so that they know, okay, like this is what this report is likely to look like. Okay, so is there anything else that you think we need to know about what to put into a report, or should we move on to what to not put in?
As long as you include good examples of numeracy and literacy, and then details of other topics, other subjects, it shows that the education is wide and it encompasses lots of different things. I think that's important, is not to show a very restricted way of learning. You need to make sure that it's clear all the things that are included.
Oh, it's interesting because I think I would have instinctively thought that as long as you were covering numeracy and literacy, they maybe weren't that fussed about anything else. But I know actually now you mention it, I seem to recall that people have come onto the odd Facebook group and said, is your child socializing? Because on your report, you haven't indicated that they're doing any social stuff. So would you be including, really quite broad things like, karate, after school club and things like that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, there are no full-on requirements for a report, but it is advisable to explain how your child socializes, or if they don't like socializing, explain why. One of my children would happily never see another person ever again.
Yeah, I've got one of them.
And that worked, same. That worked well for him, but my other son was very sociable. So, yeah, just explaining what is suitable to that child. That's the important part, is what you do is suitable to that child and why it's suitable to that child. For example, if my local authority had issue with my eldest not wanting to socialise, that the argument would have been it would have been detrimental to his mental health to make him. So you can sort of preemptively explain things, but always stay positive. Never include a we don't do because. It's we do this because. Never put a negative in.
Gotcha. So don't put in negative statements like we're not doing this, or we don't do this, but more we are doing this, we do this. Okay, great. Okay, so what should we not be putting into the report? I'm going to try to redeem myself now because I got my last one totally wrong. So I know that you shouldn't put samples of work in. Am I right? Hey! So what else should we not be putting into our reports?
Okay, examples, not samples. So you can put, my child has been learning quadratic equations using CGP, GCSE workbooks. You wouldn't put a photo of it.
Yeah.
Don't give details of people. So you can say you go to a home ed group once a week. Don't say which one. And don't say it's run at such and such a place. Because unfortunately, the more unscrupulous LAs will randomly turn up. Always use home education, not homeschooling. even if you are a fully structured, bought-in curriculum family, you are not homeschooling. That's a legally different thing. You are still home educating, and it does cause confusion with local authorities. You don't need to mention your own qualifications. It can actually be used against you, even if you are a teacher, because we've seen teachers write, I'm a qualified primary school teacher, blah, blah, blah. We unschool, blah, blah, blah. And the LA has gone, but you're a teacher, you should be following curriculum. And it turns into a whole argument. You don't need to say, I can't help my child with this because I'm not, I've not done my GCSEs. You can say, I provide access to this resource and this resource. Nothing negative about yourself. One thing a lot of people do is include lots of personal information, places they've been on holiday or are going on holiday, that their marriage has broken down, that they spend the weekends with dad. They talk about their own health. None of that matters. I mean, yes, it matters, but not in a report. This is purely about the education and how it's suitable. If you are the sole parent and you have spent a considerable time in hospital and your children have been left with various other family members, you could word that your parents have provided the education element around numeracy, or that, another home education family has been taking them to historic places. You wouldn't need to say that you were in hospital. It just include what was happening and why it was okay. You don't need to mention a specific number of hours. You just need to explain how it's full-time.
What would that look like? Explaining how it's full-time, but not saying hours.
It could say we follow school term times, we do formal learning in the morning with child-led learning in the afternoon. It could be that education takes place during the child's every waking hour. You could give examples that when the kid's having a bath, they're asking about Newton. I don't know, that there's all sorts of ways to explain it without saying we do 9 while 3, because most don't do 9 while 3. It's giving into the LA's expectation that you're going to be giving school-like terminology. So full-time is the important, not the specific hours. Mm-hmm. Don't mention future plans. Don't go saying, next month we aim to move on to this topic. Because if your kid says they're not interested in that topic, it might not happen. And your LA might say, so how did that topic go? You've then got to say, well, actually, we didn't do that. It comes across negatively. So no future plans. Yeah, I think that's mostly what not to include. There's more not to include than to include.
Do you know, it's really interesting because it hadn't occurred to me about not putting personal information in. Now, I'm gonna be really transparent here. I'm totally off the radar. I've never once been contacted by the LA, so I have never written a report. But I think I probably wouldn't have occurred to me not to do that. I think I probably would have said, oh, we go to a drama club on Wednesdays, in this place. And I think I probably would have done that. I might even have mentioned names, actually, thinking about it. But I'm guessing that this is all about protecting the privacy of fellow home educators as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's why we wrote the report, because that is the natural tendency, is to share that info. But it's not the local authorities' right to that information. And another thing to consider is what you do impacts the whole community. So if your EHE person gets 20 pages from 2 families and you send 2, they could turn around and say, well, actually, you're not giving me enough information because Joe and John give us 20 pages. Or that they use that and have done for years. They have a visit. Why don't you? They give me photos of learning. You must be hiding something. So it's really important to protect the community as a whole by only giving the information that, well, they're not really even entitled to it, but the minimal information to satisfy their informal inquiries.
I think as well, when you're a little bit nervous about the report or worrying that it might not be accepted. And of course, that's not even a thing in itself. But I think there's a tendency to kind of overshare, isn't there? There's sort of like to put everything down because you really want to validate what you're doing.
I think that's the thing. For some people, it's about having the local authority say, yes, you're doing great. But it's not their job to tell you you're doing great. It's your job to know you're doing great. Join a home ed group online. Come join Educational Freedoms group. Share what you're doing with us. Let other home eders tell you that you're doing great, or not, if you need help. But it's not information the local authority needs. But you touched on that, worrying about the local authority's response. I'd ask your listeners, what do they think is the worst the local authority would do? Nothing. They're going to come back to you and go, well, could you tell me more about this? That's it. That is their first response, would be to say, I need more information about this. At that point, you can decide whether it's information they're entitled to or not. And we've got template letters and a team able to help with those responses. But that's the worst that will happen, is they'll say, we want more info. They're not going to serve you a school attendance order immediately upon one report that doesn't satisfy them. That is a lengthy process.
I think actually when you were asking that question, I suspect that most listeners would be, that is my worst fear, is they will serve a school attendance notice.
Yeah, and they can't just do that. There's a process. They've got to give you a chance to provide more info, then serve a formal notice to satisfy, which again, it's not as scary as it sounds. You give us a shout, or another home ed group or somebody reputable, and we work out what you were missing in your report, because sometimes the LA do push boundaries. They ask for things they're not entitled to, and we suggest pushing back. We usually win. And yeah, you provide the info. If you have a horrific LA and they do push back, contact us. We know which LAs are bad. We'll give you the advice from there. But you're never alone in it. So there is no need to be scared of what their response would be. It's not their job to say you're doing okay.
And I'll be putting a link to Educational Freedom in the session notes. So wherever you're listening to this, you should be able to find the link. One thing I wanted to ask you was, I understand absolutely why you don't say what you're intending to learn, because they could hold you to that and they could come back next time and say, well, you said you were going to do trigonometry and you haven't done that. But why do you recommend not having samples of work? Is there a reason for that?
Local authority aren't entitled to it, quite simply. We are very strong believers in only giving what they're entitled to. It also backfires on a lot of people. So in a paragraph, you could detail a full year's learning in literacy, but you would need thousands of photos of worksheets, outings, the books they've read. You can't give a holistic view of the education in a few photos. And if you are providing photos, most local authorities then will say, well, we need more. You're not showing us this next reading book. You're not showing the child reading it. We want a video evidence that the child is reading it. How do we know your child really read that book? It's a slippery slope.
It is. And also, again, it's very much this idea that you're kind of putting the sample of work in almost for it to be marked by the LA, approved in some way.
Some do.
Really? Wow. Frustrated teachers.
No, genuinely. We have some come back with feedback written on things. We've had home editors provide projects that the child has completed, and they've included it in their report, and the EHE has sent it back marked with red writing and feedback on it. I mean, no.
That brings me to my last question that I wanted to ask you, which is slightly off the topic of reports, but still on the topic of local authority. What about people who might want support from their local authority? So what about people who say, And you will have heard this as often as me. My local authority lady is lovely. She comes over and she like brings me resources and she gives me gift vouchers for things and she tells me that there's a group I can go to that the local authority are running. So what about people who want that support? Is that something that you could kind of request in the report, or would you recommend really just not ever going there? Like, what's your view when it comes to that?
Can that information, resource, etc., be accessed via home educators without risk? And the answer is usually yes. If you're going to ask your LA for a resource on sewerage, we had a drain blockage the other day. That was the first thing that came to mind. You're going to wait days quite often for a response. Whereas if you go in a home ed group and say, does anybody have a resource for this? You're going to have 10 responses in 5 minutes. If you want funding for something, then yes, it's through the local authority person, but I would do that separately to the informal inquiries and your report. I would just do that as a generic, I hear this is available, how do I access it? But resources like that are very few and far between, and a positive visit is very rare. It might appear positive, it might appear she was friendly, but then when you come to figure out what the legalities actually are, you will see that they overstepped massively and did it with a smile on their face to make you think they were being helpful. They're not. It's not their job. Support isn't written into their job descriptions. Job descriptions are usually advertised as monitoring, assessment, getting children back into school. That's how they come to the job. Being your best mate is not part of it.
Yeah, and if you look at the job requirements as well for these officers, and like I say, I've never met any of them, but I've seen the job adverts, and they're no more qualified to give you advice on, to give you support or advice for home education than like, Joe down the street would be, because they're not qualified in any way, or most of them aren't. I mean, if they are, that's not in the job advert anyway. I wanted to ask about the different regions of the UK. Is there any difference between writing a report in Wales, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, very much so. We don't offer support for Northern Ireland just because their rules are very different to the rest of the UK. So I can't answer for those. Wales, the new home ed guidance is awful and far too lengthy to get into on this.
I'm actually recording a podcast tomorrow on Wales, and I recorded it once last week, and it was so difficult and complicated and woolly that we're having to do it again. It's my first ever time re-recording a podcast because the whole the legislation in Wales is just so opaque at the moment. But yeah, so sorry to butt in on that, but anyone listening, because obviously I'm based in Wales, and anyone listening in Wales will know that the best case that you can do is join our local Facebook groups, and there's a Facebook group called Home Ed Cymru, I believe.
Absolutely, 100%. That their admin team are some of the best around the home ed community. That is one group that if you're in Wales, you need to be in. The information on EdFree was written and run past that team. So we signpost to them. So in Wales, yes, it's a bit more complicated, but the same principles apply. Don't give them more than they're entitled to. And I think the generic approach is try giving them minimal. If they push back, then see where that falls within guidance and, within the Facebook group. Scotland, it's far less information because you need to have consent to withdraw your child from school. So you provide information before withdrawing. It's not deregistration up there. And then in subsequent contact, it's far, far less information. It's more focused around resources. And we have a little bit of information about that, but we have a Scottish admin who can provide support for that if necessary. So yeah, it's slightly different across the three.
Okay, that's really useful. And I actually put out a podcast a week or so ago about Scotland. And yeah, I hadn't realized, I knew the exams were different, but I hadn't realized that the withdrawing process and the deregistration process was so different there. Okay, so is there anything else that you think we haven't covered that you would like to talk about in this podcast?
Oh gosh, we don't have all week. Uh, I think the main thing is don't overthink a report. Don't overthink those informal inquiries. If your local authority writes to you and says, "Hi, how you doing?" Write back and say, "Yep, all's good, thank you." Don't say, "Here's 3 pages of a report." They didn't ask for that. If they say, "Can you fill these forms in?" you can write back and say, "Well, actually, those forms aren't really supportive of home education. So no, I'm not." Don't offer a report. Wait for them to say, "Okay, so if you don't want to visit, if you don't want to do the forms, would you provide us some written information?" But yeah, don't panic about it. Don't turn it into a big thing. It will take you longer to read our guide than to write a report. If it's taking you more than half an hour to write your report, you're overthinking it and you're putting too much information in. And I do apologise that's quite a broad statement. Obviously, there will be people that need longer to write it. With regards to paying somebody to help you write a report, what we find is the local authorities pick that up. They know when somebody has had an input into it, and using a guide is far better rather than a template or somebody else, because it's your words that are coming out onto the paper. But also providing, if you employ a tutor and they write you a report, it could and probably should be deemed as unsuitable, because the parent is legally responsible for ensuring the education is suitable, and it is the parent that needs to provide that information. The parent needs to know what the tutor is teaching the child. A tutor providing that report doesn't demonstrate that.
Ah, so not only can you save money and such like by not getting someone to do this for you, you actually shouldn't really get someone to do this for you.
Absolutely. And if you say include part of what a tutor's given feedback on, and they provide part of your report, you're then setting a precedent again that everybody else should be doing that, whether they use a tutor or not. And it's a slippery slope to new rules that shouldn't be in place.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true.
And one thing that we are trying to do is be as accessible as possible. So if you are genuinely having problems accessing the report guide, understanding it, you're getting majorly stressed about it, then reach out and we will try to find an admin member that's got time to have a chat with you and help you through it. You never have to be alone in it. But they're not a massive thing. They're just a blip in the year. Don't dread
Okay.
them.
Yeah, I mean that's I think that's such valuable advice. I was doing a series all over the last academic year with a lady who was taking her son out of school, and she took him out of school for the whole year, and we tracked her journey. We had a podcast with her every month, and she put her report in, I think in October or November, and there was so much build up for her. You know, it was such a big thing. And I think so it sounds like the advice you're giving there is don't overthink and don't overshare.
Yep.
Uh,
And don't worry if they don't respond. We hear people go, "But I spent weeks on this report and they've not even acknowledged it." That's because it's not a big thing. Some won't even read them. There are some that don't have EHE staff. The reports are just a generic letter that goes out, nobody reads it. But you replied, and that's what's important to them. So, yeah, they're just not, they don't need to be a big thing. And like I said, if the local authority don't reply, don't worry about it. It's quite common.
It's very much like the deregistration process in school, isn't it? Yeah, I think people come on and they're like, the school haven't said anything back, and it's like it's not a conversation. It's
Yeah,
you're telling them that you're deregistering your child, and just like this, you're giving them information,
yeah.
but you're not starting a conversation with them about a kind of back and forth conversation with them. Okay, so Cheryl, thank you so much. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about where they can find you, the website name, your socials, all of that kind of stuff?
You can find us everywhere. We're trying to ensure we reach everybody that's interested in home education, or the people that don't know home education is an option. So we have the website educationalfreedom.org.uk. We have a public Facebook page. We have a main Facebook group, a resources Facebook group, a SEN Facebook group, an exams Facebook group, just because everyone types something different into the search. So we wanted to cover all bases. We have an Instagram, a Twitter, and a TikTok, which, yeah, a little bit old for that one.
Have to be a Gen Z who does that one for you.
Yeah, we have some new content creators coming on board. So the team that started it found it was a little bit beyond us. So we're outsourcing to some volunteers for that one. They'll be sharing their own lives, their own home ed story, plus factual info. So that should be one to watch out for.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Cheryl, and talking us through that, because I know that even though people shouldn't worry about it, they do worry a lot about the reports, and a lot of it is just that they don't really know what they're meant to be doing, and they kind of want a bit of hand holding. And so, as we said at the very start, you don't need to pay somebody to hold your hand to write the report. You just need to listen to this podcast and go onto the Educational Freedom group, the Facebook group, and also the website, and all that information is out there, and all the community, the support that you need is out there too. So thank you so much, Cheryl. It's been really lovely having you talking us through this.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.